The United Nations says children in Sudan are facing unimaginable suffering in the ongoing civil war between the army.
Gaza is the hungriest place on earth.
Russia is said to be reeling from the unprecedented and audacious drone attacks by Ukraine. Ukraine hit multiple air bases.
2024 was one of the most violent years since the end of the Cold War. A staggering 61 conflicts were recorded across 36 countries. That's according to the latest Conflict Trends report, one of the flagship publications from the Peace Research Institute Oslo, released this week. Each year, drawing on data from the Uppsala Conflict Data Program, the report provides a snapshot of armed conflict around the world. And in these conflicts, from Gaza to Sudan, children are among the most affected and the most vulnerable. In this episode, we speak to Inger Ashing, CEO of Save the Children, one of the world's leading humanitarian organizations working to protect children in conflict zones. She joins us from Stockholm. And to Siri Aas Rustad, Research Director at PRIO and lead author of the report. I am Arnaud Siad, and this is PRIO's Peace in a Pod. Siri, Inger, welcome to this episode. Siri, you lead on the Conflict Trends report, which was just released. Can you give us the main takeaway from this year's data? Just one key element that readers of the report should take with them.
Sure. So this year we report 61 state-based conflicts. This is the highest number since we started reporting this since 1946. The level of intensity, so measured in battle death, is about the same as last year. But we see it's continuously high, as it has been for a couple of years now.
Right. And Inger, I'm so glad you're with us today. I think a lot of what the report reveals directly affects, millions of children around the world, and you and your organization, Save the Children, lead humanitarian responses in some of the worst war zones. So for our listeners, and before we get into details, can you tell us how this surge in conflict that Siri just mentioned affects children on the ground?
Yeah, thank you. And this is indeed a really important report. And I think it's important for everyone to know that every war is a war on children. And in every conflict, children suffer first and suffer most. In today's world, about 1 in 6 children, that is about 473 million children, are living under the weight of war, according to Save the Children's latest report. And this has doubled since 1990. And just maybe a quick couple of things that are happening to children when they are living in conflict and war, because it's impacting them in a very profound way, as I said. I mean, first of all, they lose loved ones, their parents, siblings, friends. Many of them are, of course, also losing their own lives or suffer life-altering injuries. And we know that children are much more likely than adults to die from blast injuries because of their smaller bodies and less blood, etc. Because of conflict, they go hungry and they face a number of preventable diseases. They see their homes being destroyed, their schools being bombed, and they also risk being recruited into armed groups. So it is leading to unimaginable trauma, including mental trauma, and it is harming their lives today, but also affecting their futures.
Siri, let's look at some of the data in the report. 2024 was the 4th most violent year since the Cold War, with over 129,000 deaths in battle, according to the report. And as you said, 61 conflicts were recorded last year. You've said, Siri, in the press release around the report, this is not just a spike, it's a structural shift. What do you mean by this surge in violence being a structural shift?
So if this were a spike, we would see 1 or 2 off years, and then it will go back to the normal trend. But we have seen now over the past decade that it's sustainably high. And as you say, it's the 4th most violent years. And it's only preceded by 2001, 2022, 2023. So the 3 years before, meaning that we are at a higher level. But maybe a different way of thinking about this is, why was the period between 2000 and 2013 so peaceful? Mm-hmm. Because if you look back 30, 40 years, we are at about the same level as we are now. So it might be fruitful to think, what were the things that the world experienced in this period? that we are not experiencing anymore. So we can think of maybe we are not facing a more violent world, maybe we are getting back to our normal. And how can we get back to that more peaceful period is a question.
I think this is where data is so important, right? Because it might address some of the biases we might all be having, especially, in this day and age where we are bombarded with images and videos. And it does feel like the world is a much worse place these days. And especially, we sit in Europe where the media focuses a lot on the war in Ukraine, obviously, which is at our doorstep, but also in Gaza. So, Siri, what does the report tell us about these two conflicts?
So it's right what you say is that we now see a lot of bigger conflicts, and that's why we see more violence, is that we see more of these bigger conflicts that we didn't see in the early 2000s. So what we see in both Ukraine and Gaza is it's quite stable compared to last year. In Gaza, including the war with Hezbollah, it was about 25,000 killed, which is the same as in 2023. And in Ukraine, it's about 76,000 people killed, both in 23 and in 24.
And of course, I just should mention for our listeners that you're looking at data from 2024, right? So this doesn't really take into account any numbers from, say, January until now, June.
No, it's not. But if we look at Ukraine and the 3 years that it has passed, there's actually almost 250,000 people killed. This is the third most violent conflict since the Cold War, only surpassed by Ethiopia and Syria. And this is only 3 years. And it's still going on. And it's the most violent international conflict. So the most violent conflict between two countries since the Iran-Iraq war. So it is sustainably high. We have seen some peace efforts this year, but my suspicion is that it will be high next year or for the 2025 data as well.
Inger, I want to ask you about Gaza because it seems to be a conflict where children have been particularly affected. I mean, according to your organization, nearly 1 million children in Gaza, nearly every single child there, is now at risk of famine. Can you tell us about the situation for children in the Strip? What are you seeing on the ground?
So Siri shared the numbers with us, and I think it's clear to everyone that the situation is devastating and it's only getting worse. And it's impacting every single child, every single person in Gaza. So we have been there for many, many years. And what we see is quite a huge shift in the abilities to respond as well with a total siege. And that's why we are reporting that nearly every single child is at the risk of famine. So because of the siege, we and everyone else have been prevented from getting aid into Gaza. We've all read about the huge number of trucks that has been stranded on the other side of the border, just waiting to come in. So as humanitarians, we have been denied our ability to help. Of course, when I speak to my team, and I was actually in Gaza earlier this year, we see that this is one of the worst, if not the worst place on earth to be a child right now, because they have literally nothing. We do a lot of activities still, including distributing water and offering education and health. One of the activities that we do with children is an activity to boost their confidence, to have them opening up and talk about what they are experiencing. And this methodology is called a wishing cloud. So what we ask the children to do is to make a wish, to talk about something they hope for and put it in the cloud. And a couple of months back, children were talking about access to education, all the normal things that children talk about in conflict. But now, in the past few months and the past weeks, more and more children are telling us that their wish is to go to paradise, to be with relatives who died. And also because in paradise, they know that there is food and water. And that is truly heartbreaking. We see children that have lost all hopes for the future and who are just struggling to have any sense of hope for the future. Families struggling. We've all seen the images. People are doing unimaginable things just to try to put food on the table. And food is very, very scarce. People are eating anything they can, leaves, old, outdated flour mixed with sand, just to put something in their stomachs. And the parents we meet feel completely helpless because they can't do anything to provide for their children. They can't do anything to ensure that they are protecting them, keeping them alive. And children don't have access to health, not getting treatment, supplies are running out. So it is a really, really challenging situation, to say the least.
You know, what you're saying is deeply troubling and really alarming. And, you know, in the last few days, we've all read in the news that there's been this new sort of US and Israeli-backed system for distributing food and other supplies to Palestinians. You know, I think it's called the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. And on May 25th, its executive director, Jake Wood, just ahead of the launch, said that the plans were not consistent with what he called the humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. And a senior UN humanitarian official described the operation as engineered scarcity. That's the term he uses. Engineered scarcity. In other words, it's designed to keep the population hungry. So, Inger, I mean, the accusation here is that it's not just that there is, you know, not enough food being distributed, it's that the aid that exists is basically being weaponized. What's your view on this sort of new Gaza Humanitarian Foundation setup and this weaponization of aid? Is this something that your organization is seeing on the ground?
We are absolutely seeing it, and we have been clear, and we stand in solidarity with the UN, with the other NGOs and INGOs that are currently operating in Gaza. We need to ensure that we are able to provide proper humanitarian aid, and that all aid that is going to be distributed has to uphold humanitarian principles. It has to be safe. It has to be dignified. We and others know that it can be done. We are still doing it because we are, as I said, providing water, etc. What we see now is that people in Gaza are being forced to walk towards the very violence that they have spent the last 20 months trying to escape in an effort to get food. We are seeing civilians being forced to walk into heavily armed zones to collect food and basic supplies under the watch of armed personnel, which is very much against the humanitarian principles. Aid is a right, and we and other humanitarian organizations know how to deliver it. So, yeah, what we see now is not the kind of humanitarian assistance that is desperately needed, and we need to go back to the normal distribution systems. Humanitarian organizations, the UN, need to be allowed to do what we do best. And I think it's really important to recognize that humanitarian aid should be neutral, unbiased. It should be distributed based on needs. And the way that it's being set up now is not that.
And aid is a right, as you said, Inger. But I think what's happening in Gaza is symptomatic, perhaps, of something larger happening to the humanitarian sector. And this has been a focus of several, of my colleagues here at PRIO, discussing the humanitarian sector at large, experiencing weaponization, but also experiencing a severe funding crisis. And I think one of the most telling examples is the dismantling of USAID, the American Agency for Aid and Development Assistance. We're talking about over 35 billion in budget for last year. And now the current US administration has terminated nearly all staff in the agency. Even their webpage has been shut down. Inger, USAID was one of Save the Children's funders, right? So how has this impacted you and the work you do on the ground?
So I think it's important to recognize that in addition to the situation that you described with the dramatic overnight cuts in USAID, and US government funding, we're also seeing a number of other donors reducing their funding to development and humanitarian aid. So we are seeing a larger trend, which is very, very troubling, because now is a time, as your report is showing, where the needs are bigger than it's been in a very, very long time. So we need to invest more. We need to contribute more. And we see a trend that is the opposite of that. Of course, as an organization, we are severely hit, as is the whole sector. It is normal that any administration, any government makes decisions on how they want to prioritize aid and what they want to focus on. What was very different this time was that overnight there was the stop work orders, which meant that awards were cancelled from one day to the other, which of course had huge effects on us and everyone else. This happens, as I said, in a time where the needs are the biggest. 1 in every 11 child globally needs humanitarian assistance. So for us, it meant that we had to significantly reduce our footprint. We have had to do huge staff cuts in our country offices around the world at global level. We have been forced to make really heartbreaking decisions to pause or end programs that support children. And these are things like stopping health clinics, closing schools, closing vaccination programs, because we simply don't have the funding anymore. And there are many, many examples of that. But just to give you one example, in Somalia, we believe that due to the lack of funding, at least 55,000 children supported by us in the past will lose access to life-saving nutrition services this month, as aid cuts forces us to close 121 supported nutrition centers. So it is on the ground leading to huge consequences, children and their families losing access to life-supporting aid, health assistance, schooling, and at the end, it's also potentially robbing them of their future. But I also think it's important to recognize that for us, and of course, it is roughly 25% of our funding that we lost, but we still have 75% of what we did still up and running. And it's more important than ever to ensure that we are able to continue that work. And we are working really hard to try to diversify our funding to ensure that we are able to continue our critical work.
I think it's so important what you said, Inger, about having lost 25% of your funding, having to reduce your activities, cutting staff, pausing or ending programs for children. I think it helps us understand the severity of the situation. And you're right that this isn't just USAID, it's a global trend. Major powers pulling away from their humanitarian commitments amid budget cuts in many countries. And Siri, this is something that you've been concerned with as well. So how do you think the current humanitarian aid crisis will impact conflict trends around the world?
So in terms of conflict trends, it's hard to say how it's going to affect the actual number of conflicts. But aid is also part of conflict prevention. So we might see more tension around the world, especially in low-intensity conflict, might increase. So that's one thing to look out for. But the other thing, and this is related to what Inger said, is that when you have decrease in funding to aid and you have an increase in violence, they multiply, right? The consequences of conflict will be much, much worse than they could have been. Not only children losing access to health and education due to conflict, but also are not given the alternative through aid. And then we'll see more conflicts like Sudan, where the number of people killed are not as large as we could maybe think. I think we report about 4,000 in 2024. But the consequences of this conflict is enormous because of famine, internally displaced people, migrants. And if in addition take away the aid, this is becoming a much bigger humanitarian crisis than it could have been if the aid were in place.
In fact, the UN has described Sudan as the most devastating humanitarian and displacement crisis in the world. That's from the UN. And as you mentioned Sudan, the report shows that Africa remained the most conflict-affected region last year, with 28 state-based conflicts recorded, I believe. That's nearly double the number of conflicts from a decade earlier. So, Siri, can you talk to us about what the report shows for conflicts in Africa?
So Africa has, as you say, increased from the mid-2000. We had a lot of conflicts that ended, like Sierra Leone, Liberia, etc. But it has slowly increased. And a lot of these conflicts are low intensity, so maybe less than 1,000 people killed each year. And there's a few which are more medium-sized, between 4,000 and 6,000 people, such as in Nigeria, Mali, Burkina Faso, Somalia. These are conflicts that are sustained over time. These are countries that have had conflict for years and I guess have adapted to it in a way. But then when we then decrease the aid, the risk that these conflicts will develop into humanitarian crisis similar to Sudan, of course, increases. And then you again get that multiplier effect of conflict when we cannot sort of help the people in need and reduce the consequences. And then we also have conflicts in Africa, like the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, which in 2025 saw a big increase in violence when the M23, the Rwandan-supported rebel group, went into Goma and later also took Bukavu. These are groups that are more interested in the resources this region can offer, so the natural resources, and basically getting rich from this region. And there are a lot of examples of this type of conflicts in Africa.
Inger, I want to take a step back for a minute. You mentioned earlier those wishing clouds in Gaza, children drawing what they wish for, and going from hoping for education to now saying they want to die so they can join their families and have food. I hope that this can sit with our listeners. It is so harrowing. But of course, education is a key element of your operations around the world. I believe your organization supported nearly 3 million children's education in 2023, half of those in Ethiopia and Yemen. So, at a time when funding is collapsing and aid becomes increasingly politicized, as we've discussed, how do you deal with being forced to make impossible choices? I mean, how do you navigate those trade-offs, considering the long-term cost of lost schooling?
Yeah, so I think that's a really important question, because as you say, the lack of funding or the reduced funding, of course, means that we and everyone else have to prioritize in ways that we would very much want to not do. So, and as I said before, in many of the countries where we operate, the immediate situation, the immediate funding cuts meant that our teams on the ground had to tell people that we can no longer provide health services, education, etc. But as an organization, we are absolutely committed to do everything we can to uphold children's rights. And we are focusing on education, health and protection, and will continue to do so. And with the cuts that we had to do, of course, we were forced to retain the life-saving work in the countries where we had to pull out. But we are also really, really investing in education and health, as I said. We believe that education is actually life-saving. And just to illustrate my point, in Ukraine, we spoke about Ukraine before. What are the key challenges that children are facing in Ukraine is the lack of proper access to education. And I've met parents there myself who talk about how the lack of education means that children are losing their ability to engage with other children, their social skills, that many of the children lose their confidence. And by participating in mobile education centers that we provide, it gives the children a sense of normality. It gives them back the ability to engage with other children, to play, a sense of normality. So I don't think we can underestimate how important education is for children, both here and now, but also for their future. So, of course, we are really pushing for education to be seen as a life-saving component, and that all humanitarian responses should have a component of education in emergencies, because we know that this is what is needed. Another example is, you also mentioned Sudan. We are doing a lot of work in Sudan and also in the neighboring countries, supporting the children who have been forced to flee the country. And I was in South Sudan, in Rink, which is close to the Sudanese border, last year, and met a number of the children that we are supporting. We are giving them psychosocial support in the refugee camp. And when I asked them what they wanted, there were two things. One was peace, and the other was access to education. So we are doing everything we can to continue to prioritize. And the good thing is that there are also a number of donors who really understands the ability for whole societies, how important education and health systems are for the ability to societies to rebuild. And as Siri said, if we are not investing in development, if we are not investing in humanitarian assistance and aid, we are also, there's a risk of increased conflict. So this is also a way of securing societies for the future and prevent conflict and get peace.
And Inger, as I listen to you and to Siri, I think a lot of people looking at images, coming out of Gaza, for instance, they feel a sense of despair, a sense of a lack of political will and accountability from, many governments around the world trying to address the terrible circumstances for children there and elsewhere, a sense that too little is being done. Inger, what would you urge global powers or multilateral bodies to do now in this landscape of multiplying crisis to protect children more effectively? What is it that should be done now immediately and that just isn't being done?
There's a number of things, of course, but I will mention a few. And maybe to start with, it is really important to recognize children as an important stakeholder group when you discuss the effects of conflict and also the solutions around peace. And again, talking about Ukraine, when I spoke to children there not that long ago, they said, when we talk about ending the war or ceasefires or peace, there's very little mentioning of the force of children and the role that children can play. And when we talk about conflicts, we often talk about weapons, we often talk about the big political powers and their fight, but not about the realities on the ground. So putting children and their needs at the center. But then, of course, if we, in all the conflicts, we are calling for the different parties to the conflict to adhere to their obligations under international humanitarian law. And we see more and more violations of that law, and that needs to be called out. Different actors need to be held accountable. So that's the accountability mechanisms and adhering to their obligations under IHL is something that we call for. Also making sure that objects, under international humanitarian law, that there is agreements that you should protect schools, you should protect hospitals. And that is really, really important that they are protected from attacks, protected from being drawn into the conflicts. We are also calling out the number of great violations against children, and we see more and more of that happening. Children being victims of as I said earlier, life-threatening injuries, losing their lives, being recruited into military forces, etc. But the majority of the governments in the world today have signed off to a number of the international legal and political instruments that provides protection for children in conflict. So it's very much holding them accountable for the things that they have already agreed that they will do. And then, of course, in both Gaza, we need urgently a ceasefire, a definite ceasefire. The same in Ukraine, in Sudan, and in many of the other countries. We need world leaders to unite that is a key priority before more children are losing their lives.
As we wrap this episode, Inger, I'd like to ask you a question that is perhaps a bit personal, but is there a story or moment that keeps you going?
There are many stories, of course, and during my time as CEO of Save the Children International, I have had the privilege of meeting so many incredibly resilient and strong children. And just to maybe share two examples, I was in Mozambique, northern Mozambique, a couple of years back, and I met this 14-year-old girl. She was heading her household. She and her siblings had lost their parents due to conflict. So she was responsible for 4 siblings, the youngest only 1 year old. And being a 14-year-old, she was dependent on the goodwill of other people in the village, the support of different actors. And when I spoke to her about what was really important for her, she spoke about how determined she was to ensure that her siblings got access to education so that they could make something out of their own lives. My own daughters were 14 years old at that time, and that made me really think about how different the world is, and that it could have been my own daughters feeling like that. And a similar situation, I was in South Sudan, as I said, last year. I met a 12-year-old boy, the same age as my own son, and he had seen his whole family being killed in front of him. And of course, nothing is ever the same. And how do you recover from such a thing? And he was talking about the nightmares he had and how he felt completely alone in the world. But what he did tell me is that when he was able to participate in our activities in our child-friendly space, he felt that he finally had a safe space. And the woman who was leading the activities had now become a new mother figure for him. So, of course, stories like this, where you see how children are fighting, because they are very, very strong and they can be part of the change if we just let them, how strong they are and how much they are at times dependent on that small push from us and others to be able to recover, realize their opportunities for themselves and their families. I mean, that is what keeps me going.
These stories are so important for us to hear and to put in perspective what we talk about when we discuss conflict trends and their impact on people, and particularly children. Siri, you come to this table not as a humanitarian practitioner, but as a peace and conflict researcher. So what do you hope the Conflict Trends Report achieve?
So I guess it's two things I hope for. It's the policymakers then to put it on the agenda to actually use this as documentation in the work that they do and to see how the trends are developing. But I think it's also important for just the public to understand what the conflict landscape look like. I mean, everyone has this feeling that the world is becoming more violent, but we know very little about things other than Gaza and Ukraine. We know very little about what's going on in Africa or in Asia or in Americas. So I think it's also to sort of broaden people's perspective, and then also for people to understand the work that Inger and her colleagues do, how important it is and how devastating these conflicts are especially for children. So I hope it's enlightening people. That's the goal.
Siri, thank you very much for sharing your insights on the Conflict Trends Report today. And Inger, thank you for the incredible work you and your colleagues at Save the Children are doing. Thank you, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening. This episode used sounds from the United Nations, BBC News, and CNN. Find out more about the report, our policy briefs, commentary posts, events, and other cutting-edge research on PRIO.org.